Thanks for being here today. A little different, for us, I think in normal years. And I know everybody's used to Zoom these days, but I think for the players, and I know myself, the first press conference and, the interviews, so a little different for us. So, bear with us. As I was thinking about today, I was thinking about, time. This is my 21st year. And as you get older, time seems to, go much faster, as many of you know. As you get older, as a young person, it seems time can go so slow sometimes at a snail's pace. And as you get older, the days seem to go quicker and quicker. But I think I speak for everybody when I think back of this past year and how slow, it seems to have gone. And to get back, and as everybody said, looking forward to New Year's and 2021. And as we've gotten to this year, remarkably, it's gone a lot quicker. And since the players have gotten back on campus, it seems to got back to, normal pace. To where the days are moving much faster and a pace that I think we all enjoy a lot more. And I know just being around those young people and being around the kids and feeling their energy and their enthusiasm and their excitement to be back out on the field, and now waking up today realizing that the season is only 3 weeks away. Certainly it brings a lot of excitement to not only to me, the coaches and the players, but around the building in Oxford and around Mississippi. A little different, I think, besides the Zoom that we're doing this today. Normally, as you know, we have this press conference the week of opening day. But we chose to do it this week just to kind of change it up and see how it'll go. I just felt, last year talking to Alex Sims, our great sports information director, that when we do it, it's almost anticlimactic when we do it that few days before opening day. Parrish and Ben and Chase and all the guys, seem to already know the starting lineup, seem to already know the rotation, and most importantly, Parrish knows the closer already, and so there's no drama, in that press conference. So we felt that maybe it would be better, to give you some thoughts and some questions and some things to write about, over the next few weeks as everybody's talking about baseball season. So what I'd like to start off doing is talk a little bit about the lineup and the rotation and the bullpen a little bit, talk a little bit about the players. As Davis, said, then I'll step away, let you ask, some of the players some questions, and then come back up, at the end and answer any questions that you may have. One of the things that being 3 weeks out, this is a projected lineup. This is, as the phrase I use a lot, if we were to start today, and as many of you know, because we got some great writers out there, some great beat reporters, that 3 weeks in baseball is a long time. And, a lot of inter squads in front of us, and certainly things could change. And I don't just mean because of injuries. I'm just talking about guys play better. Guys are more ready to play now than maybe, or more ready to play 3 weeks from now than maybe they are today. So a lot of the things that we're going to say is as we see them, right now. And so start off, we'll talk about the rotation. If we were to start today, we would start Doug on Friday, Doug Nikhazy, Gunnar Hoagland on Saturday, and Derek Diamond on Sunday. I don't think that's a surprise to many of you. Certainly, I don't think it's a surprise to us and people that follow college baseball. One of the reasons that I think the expectations are so high, right now, are because we do return, our entire rotation, and not only return, the same 3 guys, but 3 guys that can really pitch it. 3 guys. I don't know if we've ever had a solid of 3 guys to start the season, where the expectations not only were high with the program, but certainly of what they can do. Gunnar and Doug pitched, I thought really well this fall, and pitched like, aces, in the Southeastern Conference, which you would expect. Derek, as many of you know, didn't pitch this fall, in competition in inter squads per se. He had injured himself this summer. It was one of those injuries where, although we call it not serious, it's one of those that takes a while to get over, a strain in his forearm and that flexor muscle that's near the elbow, and where the doctors just said, hey, take a lot of precaution, take it really slow. And we did with Derek, let him, bat and play some outfield in the fall. But he rested a long time and then really pitched in bullpens and some controlled scrimmages late in the fall, and looked terrific. And really, I think has made some gains even in the times that we've seen him at the end of the fall and this early spring in bullpens, where his velocity has ticked up some, which was already, in the low 90s last year. I believe his slider has improved from last year, which is something that we wanted to work on and concentrate on to give him more of an out pitch. And the changeup's improved. And so we're excited about, his progress, going to the bullpen. Taylor Broadway has put together another, brilliant, fall to where I think if we were to start today, he would be the closer. Again, pitched really great 2019 fall in the 16 games of, the COVID season last year, was one of our aces out of the bullpen, and look for him to continue to do that. Braden Forsythe, who was actually the closer, I guess, when we ended the season last year, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, was leading the country in saves when the season ended, had just an average fall, but has looked really good since we've gotten back, from break, and velocities back up to what it was, I think, last year when we finished. And again, just another piece of the bullpen, which we all know that you can't have too many arms, certainly too many guys, to come in. But, one of the things where I think many of you have heard, and, leading up to the fall, and is the rosters and how many players that we have. And, one of where we see, I think, in abundance is the pitching staff. I think we have 22 pitchers on the staff right now, and a lot of them veterans, a lot of guys that have pitched valuable innings, have valuable experience, and certainly guys that, we'll count on and need this spring. Guys like Austin Miller, Max Chofie, Tyler Myers, Greer Holston, Wes Burton, Logan Savell, all guys that have pitched. I had to look down at my notes to make sure. I mean, that's a pretty big list, and those are just the returners that have pitched. Not to mention newcomers like Luke Baker from Gainesville, Florida, that had an outstanding fall. Cody Adcock, who continues to get better, from Arkansas, a guy that's got a tremendous fastball. Breaking ball's much improved. A couple other newcomers, Brandon Johnson and Josh Mallett. Brandon Johnson's a guy that, some of you saw this fall, where, would throw his fastball at days, in the mid 90s. And Josh Mallett's a guy with a really good two-seam, fastball that does has a lot of sink to it, and a slider guy. And two other guys that I need to mention that were here, last year, as freshmen, and now they're that COVID freshmen, but I think guys that are candidates for midweek starters are Jackson Kimbrell and Drew McDaniel. Drew really had an outstanding fall. Jackson, a little bit of a injury-ridden fall, but a guy that had some midweek starts for us last year, and excited for both those guys. As far as the lineup's concerned, and position player wise, kind of going around the infield and then to the outfield. Again, preface it, if we were to start today, the starting lineup would be Hayden Dunhurst behind the plate. As you know, Hayden's one of the best catchers in the country, had a freshman All-American year last year, but a guy that can do it all. Defensively, he's been spectacular behind the plate, was receiving and blocking and throwing, but also I think, ended last year with about 5 or 6 home runs, and a guy that worked really hard this fall on trying to cut down some strikeouts, trying to be able to hit put more balls in play against left-handers, take the ball the other way. And I credit him, with all his work with Coach Clement, and a guy that really I thought improved offensively from really a guy that was a good player to begin with, has even gotten better for us. At first base, Cale Baker returns, hit some, I think he finished up with 4 home runs in the short season last year, but a guy brings a lot of leadership to the team. Second base, Peyton Chatagnier returns. Peyton, again, brings so much energy, great leader, just a really good player. And a guy that competed all fall as a possible shortstop candidate, but I think he'll land at second base, at least at the beginning of the season. At third base, our team captain, again, Tim Elko. Tim's, I look back at Tim, and Tim's one of the older guys on the team's been here for a while, but man, he's really put together 2 really good years. Unfortunately for our fans, they've only been able to see a snapshot of those 2 years, because Tim, in these COVID times, when you look back at the end of the 2019 season, he goes to the Northwoods League, puts up one of the best summers in that league, comes in this, the fall of 2019, has a great fall for us, has a great shortened 16, 17 games last spring. Northwoods League's one of those leagues that's, playing this summer, one of the few leagues. Tim goes, has another really good summer, puts another really good fall together. And so for us, even though the Ole Miss annuals won't show the stats yet, Tim's kind of been a mainstay in the middle of the lineup, for us for the last couple of years. And of course, a great honor again, being selected by his teammates, as the team captain. But shortstop, I think, a lot of talk, was prior going into the fall was, what's going to happen at shortstop. And, I thought it was a kind of a great, fierce competition. I mentioned Chatagnier already, but Justin Bench, returned in the middle as a middle infielder who competed for those positions. And then TJ McCants and Jacob Gonzalez, 2 true freshmen, not to mention JUCO transfer Garrett Wood. So with all 5 of those guys competing day in and day out, for 2 positions in the middle, didn't take long to know what a special player that we have in the program, and Jacob Gonzalez, a kid that led the team in hitting in the fall, but also while doing that, making only 1 error in 20 games and playing mostly shortstop in the inter squad games. So, he's a guy that just really put together, an impressive fall, both offensively and defensively. So he'll get the nod if we were to start today, it's a starting shortstop, but proud of the fall that, McCants had, and certainly Justin Bench as well. But we'll go with Jacob Gonzalez to start with. And then in left field, another familiar name, Kevin Graham. A couple of years ago, 2019, a year and a half ago, I guess, because we talked about COVID. Kevin was a freshman All-American, and had another guy that had a really impressive fall for us offensively. I thought Kevin made some great strides. And even though he had a great freshman year a couple of years ago, some areas for improvement for Kevin were to handle left-handed pitching. He did that mostly against, right-handed pitching, and to be able to handle, the breaking ball a little bit better, be able to hit the ball the other way to cut down the strikeouts. And man, did he do that. Some great adjustments by him. I think he really matured as a hitter this fall, and again, had one of the best falls, of anybody, just a few months ago. So he'll get the nod to start in left field. Center field, we moved Justin Bench out there. So you guys that were with us last, spring, the reporters, realized that, Justin played some outfield, and really when we got shut down, he would have probably started in center field that Friday night against LSU right before we got shut down. But also look for John Rice Plumlee, who I know you'll talk about, the 2-sport, star. As many of you know, Jerry and Ely will be out for the season because of the shoulder injury. But Plumlee is there. He's done really, really well. Made some I thought, big time improvements offensively and defensively. And even though he's a tremendous athlete, I think he knows, we know that, baseball's a different game. And although he's got a unique skill set, there's some areas where, he could improve. And one of those areas was defensively, even though he's a great runner, but to take better angles at the ball, to become a better outfielder. And just in a few weeks, we could see that. And so I'm happy with that. And then made some great progress offensively. I think with Coach Clement, he's worked really hard. And a guy that I got to tip my hat to, that through the fall, when he could get over here, when he was available, he's worked his tail off to be a baseball player as well as a really good football player. Also, another candidate for center field is Cade Salmons. Cade had another good fall, hit over 300 in a fall in his back, at that position as well. And then in right field, Hayden Leatherwood, who, as many of you remember, last spring, even in the 16-17 games, he probably, because of the depth, only had about half the at bats. But when we finished playing, he was hitting around 360 with several home runs, and I think just another piece, that'll be in the middle of the lineup somewhere. When the first lineup's written out, and then at DH, Ben Van Cleve. Ben is a guy that, I think one of those fan favorites, but Ben's one of those guys that just always hits. I think, when the three times that we've kept stats from last fall, meaning 2019, this past spring, 2020, and it's 2020 fall, Ben just hits. Every day that he walks out, he just gets his hits, gets his RBIs, gets his home runs. And so I think we start today, he's the designated hitter. So I gave you a lot of information there. We're going to bring up the other guys now, let you get a chance to ask them some questions so we can get them dressed in their practice gear and get them out, because as you know, we start, this afternoon. They got to get on the field, take some BP. Doug, has got to get loose for his start. And then we'll inter squad this today, tomorrow, Saturday, and a few innings on Sunday.
All right, Ben, you want to start us off?
Yeah, Mike, speaking specifically about Gunnar, he rode the roller coaster a little bit as a freshman and then had the breakout year last year. For you, what kind of growth have you seen from him off the field, on the field, to get to where he is now, kind of living up to all the expectations of when he arrived?
Well, I really think it's what you hope, what you I guess maybe even expect. Super talented kid, obviously a first rounder out of high school, comes here with enormous pressure to succeed. He plays on a great team and in 2019. And I think he, if I'm not mistaken, started just about, I think, every Sunday of that season. So you can go back over my 20 years and look how many true freshmen started on the weekend. And so I don't necessarily disagree with the, I guess, roller coaster metaphor. But the truth is, I look back and thought, he hung in there and did a really good job, had some really big wins for us. But going into his sophomore year, one of the things that we talked about him in the sophomore fall was to locate the fastball better. And then you had to come up with a more of a killer pitch that we call, more of an out pitch, more of a swing and miss pitch. The curveball that he used in high school, and even though that it had a nice break, it just was too soft. He just, analytically, it just wasn't a great pitch. Just didn't get many swings and misses. The opposing batting average against it was not good for a pitcher. And so we started to tinker with a slider that he's messed around a little bit with in the past in high school, but didn't throw it as a freshman. And that was really the pitch I thought that made a difference for him. So obviously his sophomore year, the biggest change was the slider that gave him certainly a swing and miss pitch, a pitch that he could count on in crucial situations in the game, and just commanding the fastball better, where, you got to remember there's a difference between command and control. Control is the ability to throw strikes and not walk people. Command is the ability to throw the ball to a certain spot. He used the word, dotting up, right? To be able to throw it in a certain area on the plate, up and down, and in and out. And he's been able to do that better. And then the last piece, as the velocity, as he's continued to grow, his velocity has ticked up. And as he mentioned, even in the bullpens now, he's probably 91, 94 every 4 days in the bullpen. And, with that, he's bumped to 95 or so. And so kind of the whole package now. And I know he's excited for the season.
Mitch?
Coach, can you talk about the difficulty, scheduling difficulty going on with COVID, and if there are postponements or cancellations throughout the season? When we see what we saw in basketball with maybe a random midweek game or a random weekend game to replace some of those games that will possibly be postponed or canceled?
When you say random, are you talking about playing another SEC opponent or just adding another opponent?
Just like in non-conference play, like adding maybe, let's say, like a UT Martin on a weekend, or the Central Arkansas to Arkansas
No
State or
doubt.
something.
Yeah, I think everything is open. It's one of the reasons that I know people are frustrated about I think how late the schedule came out, but that was by design, and it was by design not only by the conference but by the coaches, the Southeastern Conference, and in a sense that we've, I think, really listened to Commissioner Sankey and asked, his advice. How did they make football happen? When probably in August, not many people gave it a shot to have a football season. And the biggest thing that he said, or the best advice that he gave us, was the best advice he said he had gotten, if I remember right, from somebody from the CDC back in March when this all went down, was that this is a new virus. We don't know a lot about it. We're learning every single day, and so if you could wait as long as possible to make your decisions, you have a much better chance of being correct. And so we tried to heed that advice. And even though I think it goes against everything as coaches, where we want things set, we want structure, we want to know where we're going to be, not just tomorrow or the next week, but for the next couple months. And so we wanted to get the schedule straight. We wanted to know, and travel plans and all those types of things. So it took a lot of, I think, discipline from the SEC coaches to wait, to be able to find out what this was going to look like. And although January hasn't been a good month, for the pandemic, we do have a light at the end of the tunnel with a vaccination, with warm weather on its way, and a chance to get this underway. And so we tried to wait as long as possible. I think it was a great decision. And so we ended up deciding that there was no reason not to play our normal schedule, as 30 conference games and 26 non-conference games. And football, I don't think, really had a choice when they made their decision, just because of travel. And one of the things that is different than football that he mentioned, he being the commissioner, is that football, their non-conference games are throughout the from week 1 to week 12. Our non-conference are the first 4 weeks, and then we go into conference play. So we're not necessarily going into a bubble, but it would be harder for them to manipulate the schedule and change opponents and, press pause and do some of the things that they did if they weren't all conference games. If they, if 1 week you were playing Appalachian State or Florida State or whatever it is. And so we took a lot of this advice and been able to pause. That's a long answer, but I don't know if you've ever gotten that. So tried to share that with all of you. But the other part of that is, yes, I think you're going to see that. I think, we have to, and baseball coaches are traditionally not very good at this, of being disrupted, being, like football. I mean, if football can figure out on a Sunday or a Monday who their next opponent's going to be, or a game getting rescheduled, in the midweek, we're going to have some adjustments. And so we realize that. We realize, even though we went with this status quo schedule, there's going to be bumps in the road, and we're just going to have to deal with it. I find it highly unlikely, but it's never like that everybody's going to play their 30 games. There's rainouts, there's travel, there's different things on a normal year. This year you're going to have some COVID things, and to where at the end of the year, I think there's going to be hopefully not as many pauses as some people may think, but I think we're just going to push through and do the best that we can. But that's a long answer to yes, there's going to be some disruptions and some scheduling changes.
Joe.
Mike, going off of that, um, do you know when the testing protocols are going to have to take place respective to when series begin? And do you know what the threshold for cancellation or pause might end up being?
I don't think it's a problem with me sharing what we think now, but what again, going off of what I just said, and hearing and getting some different information from the committee in the Southeastern Conference that makes those decisions, it's changed over the last couple months several different times as they learn more and more, about the virus. Right now, it looks like that you're going to probably get tested a minimum of twice a week, certainly for home series. It would look something, and again, don't hold me to this, but something like we would get tested on a Monday and then test again Wednesday prior to traveling on Thursday. One of the things that has also changed in that I think protocol is we thought on a home, if we were playing home weekend, we would test on Monday and Thursday, right? Leading up to, longer, time before. But the problem that they found out with basketball, because we learned that you had teams show up at a place and they couldn't play because the home team had tested positive. And they found out the day that, they were supposed to play. And so they bumped that up to Wednesday. So we would have the results prior to the opponent traveling here. Certainly don't need people, chartering a flight, spending a lot of money to fly to Oxford if, you can't play 3 baseball games. And so, again, some of that may change. There are also instances where you could, test on the weekend, but I think those are the 2 main testing days where, where we're likely to be tested on Mondays and on Wednesdays.
Are the pauses going to just kind of have to be case by case, or do you know if there's an automatic threshold for if this many players test positive, you can't play?
Great question. And it hasn't, we've talked about it. I don't want to say ad nauseum, but we've discussed it several times. No, what'll actually happen, and I don't want to go into the exact numbers because I think it'll probably be released here in the next couple of weeks, but it's got to be approved by several people, as you can imagine. But not different than other conferences, because we're all talking to one another, trying to figure out what's the best way to do this. And so you'll put an eligible roster in send it to the Southeastern Conference at the beginning of the year, and then there'll be roster minimums of which guys are eligible to play. So it's not just positive cases, but remember, at this point and where we are in a pandemic, sometimes it's really the close contacts that are going to be maybe not worry you as much, but probably keep you from playing more. And the commissioner said that as well about the football season. It wasn't the viruses that allowed football teams or made football teams pause. It was more the close contacts. They had enough players. If you just took out the positive cases, what happened was these roommates or these guys were together, and you start counting close contacts, and then that's where the numbers dwindle. So there'll be minimum roster limits where if you don't meet those, then that's when the team will not play or has an opportunity not to play. And so there's a certain amount of pitchers, a certain amount of position players, a minimum, certain minimum amount of catchers that that threshold has to be met, to say that we have too many positive cases or too many close contacts in quarantine to not be able to play.
Joe Cook.
Yeah, Coach, I know you've probably been asked this a lot or just thought about it a lot, but just talk about the good problem that you have with so much depth on the team and looking at the schedule. I mean, how are you and your coaching staff going about, looking, preparing for the season? Because there's so much talent, it's almost like you can do no wrong. So will be a lot of tinkering, or you guys, hey, we're going to stick with this kind of game plan based on how guys perform? I guess how are you just going about, developing this team and dealing with so much quality depth?
Well, I will say this, Joe. No, we're excited about our team. We think we're very talented, and we think we have plenty of depth. But I don't think we're unlike a lot of people in our league and around the country because of the COVID, because of guys getting the extra year and the expanded roster and the NCAA allowing us to extend the 35 and some other things that have happened over the past year, I don't think we're much different than a lot of people. And so, where we probably felt the abundance, if you will, has been more in the pitching staff. But right now, I think we have 41 players, but two of them, one's Jarian Ely and one's Calvin Harris. So that brings us down to about 39, which I think is probably average too low, as far as numbers. Again, like most coaches and most teams, and especially at the start of season, we really like our 39, right? We really like our players, and we think we got a good team. But I think the thing is more the pitching and how to be able to use those guys. I think we're probably pretty normal as far as numbers and depth-wise, position player-wise. Especially because of the two injuries. You knocked down two really good players in Ely and Harris. I think we're number-wise, we're very average, and where we would be on a normal year. It's just the pitching. I think we're really good with those three guys, on the weekend. But there's probably an inordinate amount of guys that we got to figure out who are the next guys, who are the guys that are going to start the midweek games, who are the guys that are going to be the first to come in. And I think that's what I am trying to lock in and focus in on over the next 3 weeks is, who's the guy that comes in? Who's the first guy? We know Doug Nikhazy's not going to finish the game against TCU. Who's going to be the guy that gets the ball first, right? In that 6th inning or 7th inning, who are the guys that lead up to the 9th inning? If you figure Broadway's your last guy, who are the guys in the middle? And then the first weekend, which makes it kind of extraordinary, is such great competition to where the games will likely be close, one way or another. And so the moves that you make, I think are super critical, to the games. And you don't really get a breather or to let them run out there a weekend or two to try to figure out who those guys are. And so I think the next 3 weeks in the inter squads are going to be critical to deciding that.
Andre.
Thank you. Hey, Coach. Going back to the pitching again, I wanted to ask you about Doug and what you like about him in that series opener spot. And also, he said he's been, working on his secondary pitches, primarily his slider. Just kind of what have you seen out of the progress he's made in that regard?
Well, first, Doug's, was the Friday night guy last year, and as a true freshman, was outstanding, and maybe arguably our best pitcher, at the end of the 2019 season. We get to 2020, and I think everybody, when you run Doug and Nikhazy out, you got a great shot to win, and that's a great feeling on Friday night. It's tough to win in our league if you can't win on Friday night. There's just so many aces around the league, and there's been years where we've had real good teams and teams where I thought we pitched well, but we didn't pitch well enough on Friday night. And if you don't pitch well enough on Friday night, you're swimming upstream the rest of the weekend. And so having him back on Friday night certainly makes you feel really good. And then the second part of your question about secondary stuff, one of the things that made Doug so good is he's got not only an outstanding fastball, a fastball that tends to have a lot of ride to it, to seem like it's rising. He gets a lot of swings and misses and chest high type fastballs, but he's also that kind of complements that, has got an outstanding curveball. And so I know you asked about the slider because he said it, but really the number 2 pitch is the curveball. And so you got one that's riding, and literally his vertical break is anywhere from 18 to 21 inches, and it's almost the opposite vertical drop with the curveball. And so out of the hand, you basically got 3 feet that the ball's likely to travel. And so the 2 pitches that fight for the third spot in his arsenal is the changeup and the slider. The slider's really been and he added it last year. or really improved it last year, where it gave him, if you remember, if you watched the games and paid attention to the left-handed hitters, it gave him another piece, another bullet in his gun, if you will, where as a freshman he really didn't have. He wasn't as dominant against left-handed hitters as if you would have liked him to be. Although as dominant as he was as a freshman hitter, probably his numbers against left-handed hitters wasn't as good. And the sliders really helped him improve that and give him another, again, another weapon against the left-handers. And he's, like he said, he's learned to throw it a little firmer. But what we've really tried to concentrate on really at the end of the fall is just really location, to not miss in bad spots, to try to not miss in the middle of plate as much with it. And I think it's going to be an outstanding pitch for him this year.
Ben.
Yeah, Mike, I asked you about Kevin Graham at the end of the fall, and y'all challenged him. He responded and performed so well. You saw Tim do this in his third year, where he broke out and just had that really great year. How do you carry over a fall like that, like Tim did, and be productive in the season? And how can Kevin continue that and get to that place where he's proven production every single day?
It's a great question, Ben, and I wish I had the answer. I wish I had the answer to say, hey, this is the magic dust that you get sprinkled on you, and now you go from good to great. And there was a kid that as a freshman had a really good freshman year, but how do you take it to the next level? And guys, you mentioned Tim and others. I've looked over the years, and you look at guys that maybe didn't play as good their first year, first couple years, like Tate Blackman or Sykes Orvis or Will Allen, and how they matured. But isn't that what happens a lot of the times? I know we want to see them, be stars immediately, like a Doug Nikhazy, right? But if you look even at Gray Kessinger, right, a Thomas Dillard, and guys that struggled as freshmen, Cooper Johnson, it happens more times than not where it's tough to play in our league, and it's tough to do it early on. If you can do that, you're super special. But so my hope is it's just his maturation as a player, and to watch the way Kevin carried himself this fall, and not just, okay, he had some good numbers and he's on his way, but why did he have the good numbers? And I think that's why he feels confident. And I think we being myself and Coach Clement and others, when you watch just his improvement, and I said earlier, his maturation as a hitter, where as a freshman, he was really the guy, and he's good at it, a guy that can really ambush a fastball. And what I mean by that is, you get in good counts, as a freshman, and you're batting seventh, eighth in the lineup, and it's 2-0, and you're getting a fastball. He was as good as anybody in the country on not missing, not being late, not fouling it off, being able to drive it into the park. It's almost like, oh, it's 2-0. If they throw him a strike here, he's going to hit it into the bullpen. That's how good he was as a freshman. But if it was versus a left-handed pitcher, if it was versus a pitcher that got ahead of him, he wasn't as he became average. And so his improvement this fall was being able to handle the left-handed pitcher much better. To watch him handle Doug Nikhazy in inter-squad games, one of the best left-handed pitchers in the country, to watch him handle the off-speed and use the other field, to use the left side of the field. That's, I think, the reason that he had such a good fall. And I think why he, not only we are, feeling good about it, but why, he should feel good about going into the spring.
And you brought up those 22 pitchers, which is really unique. Does it make it more challenging as far as getting guys innings, or because you're on a regular schedule, could it be easier maybe to establish roles, manage usage throughout the week, midweek?
You kind of bite
And
your
for lack of a
tongue.
better word, save your top back end guy.
Okay, I missed that last part. I started talking.
No, I'm sorry. And for lack of a better word, save your top back end guys, because you can use those other guys in the midweek.
Yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, you got to win games. And so it is a challenge, I think, early on. We try to do that. We try in the 4 weeks that we got to play some different people, not just with the pitching, with the position players as well. We talked about it in the staff meeting today, where, we have to be able to try to use, more than the 9 or 10 guys. We got to try to expand in certain games. Certainly, if you're good and you're winning and you're ahead, it makes it a lot easier. I don't deny that, and anybody that does is lying to you. At least in their heart, it's a lot easier to make some of those moves. But you're right. I think with the pitchers, we have to do that. We have to run some guys out there. But also, what I tried to say earlier to Joe's question was, we're going to learn a lot more over the next 3 weeks. They're all going to have 3 different outings. We've been watching bullpens. We're healthy on the mound. We've always said you can't have too many pitchers, right? And so, to sit here and think that we're going to have too many of them, I think is foolish. We just got to make sure that we try to find the right ones as soon as possible.
Nick?
Kind of going off that with Tyler Myers specifically, what's his journey back from injury been, and just how available is he right now? Is he 100%, or are there still some things he's working out?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second part of that is, yeah, he's 100%. I mean, he'll throw, and he's been throwing since he's gotten back in January on the same throwing program as all the guys. And so he's hit every bullpen. He usually matches up with Gunnar, in the bullpen. He's a Saturday guy, so he'll throw tomorrow in the inter squad games. But as far as pitch count or anything like that, which I think you're alluding to, Nick, no, I think he'll be right with everybody else. We see him as a reliever. You hate to box people in like that. I mean, I've watched guys, be so effective out of the bullpen that, you needed help as a starter and you push them into that role and they flourish. But I think without a doubt, especially where we are with the depth, I think he's going to be just another piece of the bullpen. But he's been terrific. He's been a guy that's been 88 to 92. And again, it's January and it's less than a year, out of Tommy John surgery. And so he's hit every mark through his throwing rehab and all that protocol. And if you know Tyler, you'd root for him. I mean, he's just just an awesome kid that's always got a smile on his face, and a guy that brings a ton of energy and is upbeat and positive. And I see no reason why he's not going to be a piece of this bullpen. But how that evolves and what piece, that's what's the last 3 questions have been. We'll just have to wait and see.